Hello again, class. So today this week, to kind of start off our discussion for this week, you're going to be reading 3 chapters that are talking about Native American education. And so if you may remember that we've already looked a little bit about Native American education before colonization. And so now this is looking more specifically at federal policies about education towards Native Americans and where in kind of the Civil War era, so like 1850s, 1860s, all the way through like 1890s. But really a lot of these policies that we're talking about spread into about like the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. And so even though we're talking about a long time ago, these things still had very big impacts on the lives of people alive today. So to start off, I want to talk about 2 concepts that are going to be very important in this class. One is called differential racialization, and I'm going to give you the definition of this in our discussion forum. But basically what differential racialization means is it's a theory, it's a way of looking at this history that basically explains that a minority group's status, social status in the United States has a direct connection to the educational policies and educational practices associated with that group. And it also has a direct connection with the stereotypes and other justifications that are made for the educational practices. So, for example, we've already looked at some of the history of African Americans in education, and we saw how especially in the culture of the South that wanted to keep African Americans in this lower, inferior status. So because they wanted to keep African Americans in that status, then they also came up with stereotypes and other justifications for keeping them there by saying that they're 1,000 years behind in civilization, and so they need certain kinds of education in order to catch up. So like that was one way to justify industrial education and to justify education that taught African Americans that their place is working with their hands. It's not in political places. It's not using their minds so much, because the justification is that they were behind in civilization. We're going to see that similarly with Native Americans. So I'm going to want you to focus in on what kind of stereotypes and justifications are used to design the federal education policy towards Native Americans, and how the education system and the educational practices that they were exposed to kind of contributed to that. So you have 3 chapters to read this week. First one is called Reform. And in Reform, this is what I want you to focus on. I want you to focus on asking the question, just how did the federal government form its education policy towards Native Americans? And so that's going to go into what role did Native Americans essentially play in this stage in United States history. What did the dominant culture want out of Native Americans? You're going to be looking for that in the reading. And then how does that add to the stereotypes, the justifications? And so look for how they're defining Native Americans and what they quote unquote need out of education. That's very important to pay attention to. Next, you're going to be reading a chapter called Models. And in Models, it's going to talk about 3 different types of schools that then were created for Native Americans on reservations. So first, you're going to be looking for what are the characteristics of the reservation day school. Next, what are the characteristics of the reservation boarding school, and then finally, what are the characteristics of the off-reservation boarding school. As long as you understand those three things, that's what you need out of models. And so lastly, you're going to be reading a chapter called Institutions. In Institutions, I want you to look at how did the rules and practices in off-reservation boarding schools, how did that strip Native Americans of their cultural identity? And to expand on that, when you're going into your discussion blog post, we're going to be moving those to the discussion forum, by the way. I want you to talk about what are the various ways that Native American cultural identity was stripped from them, and how did that play into the role that Native Americans had. So again, thinking about what is their place in the social hierarchy of this time, and then how did these schools contribute to that place in the social hierarchy. You need to have your post be at least 500 words. And so really think about all of these questions that I've posted. Think about all of the main points that I post with the articles themselves. And this post is due by Saturday at 11:55 p.m. And so if you have questions, if you want to bounce some of your ideas off of me, you can definitely post some of those questions, and I'll be monitoring the discussion forum to see if I can answer those and help you as you put this together. So happy reading. Definitely pay attention to what articles you're putting together and what arguments you want to put together. And I will see you this time next week.